Captain Zyx'norp of the Galactic Federation's Humanitarian Aid and Rescue Division hard prided himself on running the tightest ship this side of the Andromeda Galaxy. His crew was a hand-picked assortment of the most compassionate beings from a dozen different species, each one dedicated to the noble cause of swooping in to save helpless creatures from the far reaches of space. Little did Zyx'norp know that his perfect record of successful rescues was about to be shattered by a pint-sized terror from a backwater planet called Earth. It all began on what should have been a routine mission. The hard ship Benevolence had picked up a distress signal from a remote asteroid belt, and upon investigation, discovered a lone escape pod drifting aimlessly through space. Inside was a small human child, no more than 6 Earth years old, with unruly brown hair, and a face smeared with what appeared to be the remains of some sort of confectionery. "Oh, you poor, precious thing," cooed Lieutenant Gloop, her gelatinous form quivering with sympathy as she peered at the child through the pod's viewport. "Captain, we simply must rescue this defenseless creature at once." Zyx'norp's tentacles twirled thoughtfully. "Indeed, Lieutenant. Prepare the tractor beam and alert medical. We'll have this little one safe and sound in no time." As the tractor beam engaged and began to draw the escape pod into the Benevolence's docking bay, a chorus of awes and how adorable echoed throughout the bridge. Even the normally stoic security chief Claak allowed one of his chitinous mandibles to twitch in what passed for a smile among his species. The moment the pod's hatch hissed open, however, all hell broke loose. "Yippee!" shrieked the human child, launching himself out of the pod like a sugar-fueled missile. He bounced off Gloop's gelatinous body with a wet splat, ricocheted off a bulkhead, and proceeded to run circles around the assembled crew, all while shouting something that sounded suspiciously like Baby Shark at the top of his lungs. "Great galaxies!" exclaimed Zyx'norp, his tentacles flailing in alarm. "Someone contain that creature." Claak stepped forward, mandibles clicking authoritatively. "Now see here, small human. I must insist that you cease this disorderly behavior at once and submit to proper decontamination procedures." The child skidded to a halt, tilting his head to one side as he regarded the imposing insectoid. Then, without warning, he launched himself at Claak with a gleeful cry of buggy and latched onto one of the security chief's legs. "Unhand me this instant," Claak bellowed, trying unsuccessfully to shake the child off. "I am not a buggy, I'll have you know. I am a highly respected member of the Shurtikin Royal Guard," seconded to Oof. The oof was the result of the child somehow managing to scale Claak like a tree and perch atop his head, tiny fingers exploring the alien's antennae with unrestrained curiosity. Captain Claak said with as much dignity as he could muster, "I respectfully request immediate assistance in removing this parasite." Zyx'norp sighed, realizing that this rescue mission was rapidly spiraling out of control. "Right, Gloop, if you would be so kind as to absorb our young guest and transport him to medical for examination." Gloop burbled in agreement and oozed towards Claak, her gelatinous form rippling in anticipation. The child, however, had other ideas. With a squeal of delight, he leapt from Claak's head directly into Gloop's amorphous body. "Oh my," Gloop exclaimed, her voice oddly muffled. "Captain, I appear to have ingested the human child. This is most irregular." "Well, uningest him immediately," Zyx'norp ordered, his tentacles tying themselves in knots of frustration. "I'm trying, sir, but he seems to be swimming." "Yes, swimming quite vigorously inside me. It's rather ticklish, actually." "Tee-hee." The sight of the normally composed Lieutenant Gloop giggling and jiggling as the small human child performed what appeared to be an enthusiastic butterfly stroke through her transparent body was almost too much for Zyx'norp to bear. He closed 3 of his 5 eyes and took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was a professional and that surely they could handle one small human child. "Right," he said, his voice strained but determined. "New plan. Gloop, make your way to medical. The rest of you, form a perimeter. We'll escort our guest to the examination room and figure out what in the name of the great void we're dealing with." As Gloop wobbled her way down the corridor, occasionally emitting high-pitched giggles as the child found particularly sensitive spots within her gelatinous form, Zyx'norp couldn't help but wonder if perhaps they should have left this particular rescue well enough alone. The procession that made its way to the medical bay was nothing short of absurd. Gloop led the way, her usually smooth surface riddled with child-shaped bulges that appeared and disappeared at random. Claak brought up the rear, his normally impeccable exoskeleton covered in small, sticky handprints. The rest of the crew formed a wary circle around Gloop, ready to pounce should their guest make a break for it. Dr. Zyx'norp, the Benevolence's chief medical officer, was waiting for them, his bark-like skin rustling with anticipation. "Ah, Captain. I understand we have a new patient. Where is the little dear?" As if on cue, the child's head popped out of Gloop's midsection, a wide grin plastered across his face. "Hi, tree man. Wanna play?" Dr. Zyx'norp's branches quivered in surprise. "Well, I'll be photosynthesized. In all my years of xenobiology, I've never seen anything quite like this." Yes, Zyx'norp said impatiently. "Fascinating, I'm sure. Now can you please examine the child and tell us what we're dealing with, and more importantly, how we can keep it under control?" The doctor nodded, his leaves rustling thoughtfully. Of course, Captain. If our young friend would be so kind as to extricate himself from Lieutenant Gloop, we can begin the examination. You heard the Dr. Zyx'norp address the child, trying to sound stern but authoritative. Come out of there this instant. The child pouted, his lower lip quivering dangerously. But I don't wanna. It's fun in here, like a big, squishy waterbed. Gloop, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, suddenly burbled in alarm. Captain, the child appears to be. Oh dear, he's. With a sound like a wet balloon being rapidly deflated, Gloop suddenly expelled the child in a geyser of gelatinous goo. The boy shot across the room like a slippery torpedo, landing with a splat against Dr. Silifoid's trunk. "We," the child exclaimed, sliding down the doctor's bark. "Let's do that again." "Absolutely not, Zyx'norp," Gloop and Klayak shouted in unison. Dr. Silifoid, showing a patience that Zyx'norp could only envy, gently detached the child from his trunk and set him on the examination table. "Now then, young man, let's have a look at you, shall we? Can you tell me your name?" The boy, momentarily distracted by the array of blinking lights and strange instruments in the medical bay, looked up at the doctor. "I'm Timmy. Are you really a talking tree? Do you make syrup? Can I climb you?" "One question at a time," Timmy. Dr. Silifoid chuckled, his branches swaying in amusement. "I am indeed a sentient plant-based life form, but I'm afraid I don't produce syrup, and climbing is strictly off limits, I'm afraid. Now, can you tell me how you ended up in that escape pod?" Timmy's face scrunched up in concentration. "Well, Mommy and Daddy were taking me to Disney Planet for my birthday, but our ship got all shaky and there were lots of flashy lights and loud noises. Then Daddy put me in the pod and said I was going on an adventure. Are we at Disney Planet now? Is this a ride?" Zyx'norp felt a twinge of sympathy for the child, quickly followed by a surge of panic at the thought of explaining to Timmy that he was, in fact, very far from any sort of amusement park. Before he could formulate a response, however, Dr. Silifoid's medical scanner began to beep urgently. "Great galaxies," the doctor exclaimed, his leaves rustling in agitation. "Captain, I'm detecting dangerously high levels of a substance called, let me see, refined sucrose in Timmy's bloodstream. And there are trace amounts of something even more potent. Ah yes, high fructose corn syrup. It seems our young friend here is in the throes of what humans call a sugar rush." Klaak's mandibles clicked in confusion. A sugar rush? Is it some sort of human combat technique? Dr. Silifoid shook his branches. "Not exactly, Chief Klaak. It's a state of hyperactivity induced by the consumption of large quantities of sugar. It appears young Timmy here has ingested an amount that would be considered excessive even by human standards." "Well, how long does this sugar rush last?" Zyx'norp asked, dreading the answer. The doctor consulted his readings. "Based on these levels, I'd say we're in for at least another 6 to 8 hours of heightened activity." A collective groan went up from the assembled crew. Timmy, oblivious to their distress, had discovered the anti-gravity controls on the examination table and was gleefully bouncing up and down, occasionally floating to the ceiling before plummeting back down with a giggle. "Look at me," he shouted. "I'm an astronaut. Pew, pew, pew. Take that, space pirates." Zyx'norp's tentacles drooped in resignation. "Very well. Dr. Silifoid, is the child in any immediate danger?" "No, Captain. The sugar rush is uncomfortable but not life-threatening. However, I would advise against giving him any more sugary substances, and perhaps we should consider some form of containment." As if to emphasize the doctor's point, Timmy chose that moment to execute a particularly enthusiastic bounce that sent him careening off the table and straight towards an array of delicate medical equipment. "I've got him," Gloop exclaimed, quickly reshaping herself into a gelatinous safety net. Timmy bounced off her with a wet splat, giggling madly. "Again. Again," he demanded, already scrambling back towards the anti-gravity table. Zyx'norp felt a headache coming on in all three of his brains. "Right, new plan. We need to find a way to entertain our guest until this sugar rush subsides. Any suggestions?" The crew exchanged nervous glances. They were trained to handle all manner of intergalactic crises, from asteroid collisions to hostile alien invasions, but a hyperactive human child. This was well outside their area of expertise. Perhaps Klaak ventured hesitantly, "We could introduce the child to the ship's holodeck. I understand human offspring enjoy immersive simulations." "Excellent idea," Chief Zyx'norp said, seizing on the suggestion like a drowning man grasping a life preserver. "We'll create a safe, contained environment where Timmy can expend his excess energy." And so began what would later be known among the crew as the Great Holodeck Fiasco of Stardate 2876.5. At first, things seemed to be going well. Timmy was delighted by the holodeck's ability to create any environment he could imagine. He bounced through simulated forests, splashed in holographic oceans, and even had a tea party with a group of talking stuffed animals that left Zyx'norp questioning the sanity of human children's entertainment. But as the hours wore on and Timmy showed no signs of slowing down, the crew's initial optimism began to fade. They watched in mounting horror as the child's imagination, fueled by a seemingly inexhaustible supply of sugar-induced energy, pushed the holodeck systems to their limits. "I want to ride a dinosaur," Timmy demanded, and suddenly the serene forest was filled with thundering herds of prehistoric beasts. "Now I want to be a superhero," he shouted. And before anyone could object, he was flying through a bustling cityscape, gleefully saving holographic civilians by picking them up and depositing them on rooftops regardless of their protests. "Ooh, let's have a space battle," and just like that, the holodeck transformed into a chaotic scene of interstellar warfare, with Timmy somehow managing to pilot a starship with the reckless abandon only a 6-year-old could muster. Through it all, the crew of the Benevolence did their best to keep up. Gloop found herself constantly reshaping to catch Timmy as he flung himself off various holographic structures. Clack's exoskeleton was put to the test as he attempted to wrangle dinosaurs and corral errant spaceships. Even Dr. Zyx'norp got into the act, using his branches to snatch Timmy out of the air when his flying became a bit too realistic. Zyx'norp, for his part, could only watch in a mixture of awe and abject terror as his carefully selected crew of elite galactic rescuers was run ragged by a single human child. He made a mental note to recommend a substantial increase in the dealing with unpredictable lifeforms portion of HARD's training regimen. Just when it seemed that Timmy's energy might actually outlast the holodeck's power supply, Dr. Zyx'norp's medical scanner began to beep. The doctor, looking somewhat worse for wear with several leaves missing and a distinct list to his trunk, checked the readings with visible relief. "Captain," he announced, "I'm detecting a significant drop in Timmy's blood sugar levels. The crash should be imminent." As if on cue, Timmy, who had been in the middle of leading a charge of holographic knights against an equally holographic dragon, suddenly stopped. He blinked owlishly, looked around at the chaos he had created, and then let out an enormous yawn. "I'm sleepy," he announced to no one in particular, and with that he curled up on the holodeck floor, which had obligingly transformed into a soft, grassy meadow, and promptly fell asleep. The sudden silence was almost deafening. The crew of the Benevolence stood frozen, hardly daring to believe that their ordeal might finally be over. Gloop, who had been stretched to her absolute limits containing Timmy's latest adventure, slowly oozed back into her normal shape. Clack's antennae twitched warily, as if expecting this to be some sort of trick. Zyx'norp approached the sleeping child cautiously, all 5 of his eyes blinking in disbelief. Is it over?" he whispered. Dr. Zyx'norp nodded, his branches creaking as he straightened up. "Yes, Captain. The sugar crash has finally occurred. Timmy should sleep for quite some time now as his body recovers from the excitement." A collective sigh of relief whooshed through the holodeck, causing the simulated grass to ripple as if caught in a breeze. Zyx'norp felt his tentacles begin to unknot for the first time in hours. "Right," he said, trying to inject some authority back into his voice. "Let's get our young guest to proper quarters, and then I believe we all deserve." As Gloop gently enveloped the sleeping Timmy and began to transport him to guest quarters, Zyx'norp couldn't help but marvel at the sheer chaos one small human child had managed to create in such a short time. He made a mental note to update the Galactic Federation's database on humans, with a particular emphasis on their apparently superhuman abilities when under the influence of refined sugars. The next few hours passed in blessed silence as the crew of the Benevolence caught their breath and attempted to restore some semblance of order to their ship. The holodeck required a complete systems reboot after Timmy's imaginative onslaught, and poor Clack spent the better part of an hour trying to remove sticky handprints from his exoskeleton. Just as things were starting to feel normal again, Dr. Zyx'norp's communicator chirped urgently. "Captain," the doctor's rustling voice came through. "Our young guest is showing signs of waking. I thought you'd want to know." Zyx'norp felt all 3 of his hearts sink. "Understood, Doctor. I'll be right there. And perhaps you'd better prepare some sort of sedative, just in case." When Zyx'norp arrived at the guest quarters, he found Timmy sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes sleepily. The child looked considerably less manic than before, but there was still a glint in his eye that made the captain's tentacles twitch nervously. "Good morning," Timmy Zyx'norp said cautiously. "How are you feeling?" Timmy blinked up at him, then broke into a wide grin. "Hi, Mr. Squidface. I had the best dream ever. I rode dinosaurs and flew like Superman and fought dragons and—" Yes, Zyx'norp interrupted hastily, not wanting to relive the dream in question. "That sounds lovely. Now, Timmy, we need to have a little talk about your air adventure." As Zyx'norp attempted to explain the situation to Timmy in terms a human child could understand, the rest of the crew hovered anxiously nearby. Gloop had positioned herself strategically by the door, ready to form a gelatinous barrier should Timmy make a break for it. Clack stood at attention, though his antennae kept twitching towards the ventilation shafts as if calculating escape routes. "So you see," Timmy Zyx'norp concluded, "we're not actually a Disney planet, we're on a rescue ship, and we're trying to figure out how to figure." Timmy's lower lip began to quiver dangerously. But I want to go to Disney Planet. Mommy and Daddy promised." Zyx'norp felt a wave of panic wash over him. The last thing they needed was for Timmy to have another sugar-fueled meltdown. Now, he said quickly, I'm sure we can find something even more exciting than Disney Planet right here on the Benevolence. In fact, I bet Chief Clack would love to give you a tour of the ship, wouldn't you, Chief? Clack's mandibles clicked in what might have been protest, but a stern look from Zyx'norp silenced him. Of course, Captain, he said stiffly. It would be my pleasure. And so began Timmy's grand tour of the Benevolence, with the increasingly frazzled crew doing their best to keep the child entertained, and more importantly, contained. They showed him the engine room after carefully locking away anything that looked even remotely explosive, let him pilot the ship from the safety of the captain's chair with the actual controls firmly locked, and even gave him a lesson in alien biology courtesy of Dr. Silofoid, who bore Timmy's constant poking and prodding with admirable patience. Throughout it all, Zyx'norp and his crew kept a wary eye on their young charge, ready to spring into action at the first sign of another sugar-induced frenzy. But to their immense relief, Timmy seemed content with merely asking a million questions a minute and occasionally attempting to climb Clack like a jungle gym. As the tour wound down and Timmy's endless stream of why questions began to slow, Zyx'norp dared to hope that perhaps they had weathered the worst of the storm. That was, of course, until they reached the ship's galley. And this, Clack was explaining with the air of someone reaching the end of their patience, is where we prepare our nutritional sustenance. Timmy's eyes lit up. You mean the kitchen? Cool. Can I have a snack? I'm hungry. Before anyone could stop him, Timmy had darted into the galley and begun rummaging through the food synthesizers. Zyx'norp felt a sense of impending doom as he watched the child gleefully punching buttons. Timmy, wait, he cried, but it was too late. With a cheerful ding, the synthesizer produced what appeared to be a mountain of brightly colored, sugar-coated confections. Timmy's eyes grew wide with delight. Candy, he exclaimed, reaching for the sugary treasure trove. What followed could only be described as barely controlled chaos as the entire crew of the Benevolence mobilized to separate one small human child from a potentially catastrophic sugar overdose. Gloop formed herself into a gelatinous barrier between Timmy and the synthesizer, while Clack attempted to reason with the child using his most authoritative mandible clicks. In the ensuing scuffle, the mountain of synthesized candy went flying, scattering across the galley in a rainbow of sugary projectiles. Timmy, displaying an agility that would have impressed even the most seasoned Gorgonian acrobat, managed to snag a handful of the confections before Zyx'norp could wrap a tentacle around him. No, Timmy, Zyx'norp shouted, his voice rising to a pitch he hadn't known he was capable of. We do not need another sugar rush. Put those down immediately. But Timmy, with the single-minded determination only a child confronted with forbidden sweets can muster, had already stuffed the candy into his mouth. He grinned up at Zyx'norp, his cheeks bulging and smeared with multicolored sugar. Mimf, he said, which Zyx'norp could only assume was an attempt at "you can't stop me." For a moment, the galley was silent save for the sound of Timmy's enthusiastic chewing. The crew of the Benevolence stood frozen, watching in horrified fascination as the human child swallowed the last of his sugary prize. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Timmy's eyes widened, and a maniacal grin spread across his face. "Uh-oh," Gloop burbled. "Brace for impact," Clack intoned grimly. Zyx'norp could only watch in mounting terror as Timmy began to vibrate with barely contained energy. "May the great void have mercy on us all," he muttered. What happened next would go down in Galactic Federation history as the candy-pocalypse of Stardate 2876.6. Timmy, his system once again flooded with an unholy amount of sugar, became a whirlwind of hyperactive chaos that made his previous antics seem tame by comparison. He bounced off walls, swung from light fixtures, and somehow managed to reprogram the food synthesizers to produce nothing but ice cream and gummy worms. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly as Timmy discovered the environmental controls, leaving crew members floating helplessly as the giggling child swam through the air. At one point, Timmy got his hands on the ship's internal communication system and treated the entire crew to an ear-splitting rendition of what he claimed was the song that never ends. Zyx'norp made a mental note to file a formal complaint with Earth's government about the apparently torturous nature of their children's music. Through it all, the crew of the Benevolence did their best to contain the sugar-fueled tornado that was Timmy. Gloop found herself stretched to her absolute limits, forming barriers, safety nets, and at one point, a makeshift hamster ball in an attempt to contain the child. Clack's exoskeleton was put to the test as he attempted to outmaneuver Timmy through the ship's corridors, his normally precise movements reduced to an awkward scramble. Dr. Silofoid, in a moment of inspiration or perhaps desperation, attempted to create a calming herbal tea using his own leaves. The result was a concoction that put 3 junior officers to sleep but seemed to have absolutely no effect on Timmy. As for Zyx'norp, the esteemed captain of the Galactic Federation's finest rescue vessel found himself reduced to chasing a giggling human child through the ship's air ducts, his tentacles tangling in knots as he tried to navigate the tight spaces. "Come back here this instant," young man, Zyx'norp called, his voice echoing through the metal shafts. "In the name of all that is orderly in the universe, please calm down." Timmy's only response was a gleeful laugh and the sound of small hands and feet scampering further into the labyrinth of ducks. Just when it seemed that the Benevolence might be torn apart by the sheer force of one human child's sugar-fueled rampage, salvation came from an unexpected quarter. As Timmy emerged from an air vent into the ship's cargo bay, he found himself face to face with the newest member of the crew, Junior Maintenance Technician Blorp. Blorp, a recent graduate of the Galactic Federation's Academy, was a squishmallow, a species known for their remarkably huggable bodies and soothing bioluminescent glow. He had been quietly organizing spare parts in the cargo bay, blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding throughout the rest of the ship. Timmy skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with wonder. "Who?" he breathed. "You look like a giant glow-worm teddy bear." Blorp, who had been warned about the human child but hadn't quite believed the stories, blinked his large, luminous eyes. "Oh, hello there," he said in a voice that sounded like warm honey and soft pillows. "You must be Timmy. Would you like a hug?" Before anyone could warn Blorp about the dangers of an overstimulated human child, Timmy had launched himself at the unsuspecting squishmallow with a joyful cry. But instead of bouncing off or causing chaos as he had with every other crew member, Timmy simply sank into Blorp's soft, glowing body. A moment of stunned silence fell over the cargo bay. Zyx'norp, who had just emerged from the air vent with his tentacles tied in knots, held his breath. Clack, his exoskeleton dented and scratched, froze mid-step. Even Gloop, who had oozed into the room in a state of near exhaustion, managed to form a single eye to watch the scene unfold. And then, miracle of miracles, they heard a sound that had seemed impossible mere moments ago, a soft, gentle snore. Blorp looked down at the human child nestled against him, now fast asleep and drooling slightly. "Oh my," he said softly. "Is this not what he's supposed to do?" Zyx'norp felt a wave of relief so profound he thought he might faint. "Blorp, my dear boy," he said, his voice quivering with emotion, "you may have just saved this entire ship from destruction. Don't move a molecule." And so, as the crew of the Benevolence set about repairing the damage caused by Hurricane Timmy, Blorp settled into a comfortable position in the cargo bay, gently cradling the sleeping human child. His natural bioluminescence cast a soothing glow over Timmy, keeping the sugar crash nightmares at bay. In the days that followed, as they made their way to the nearest human colony to reunite Timmy with his no doubt frantic parents, the crew developed a new appreciation for the resilience of their ship, the importance of sugar-free snacks, and the unexpected heroism of Junior Maintenance Technician Blorp. Zyx'norp, for his part, spent hours updating the Galactic Federation's database on humans, with extensive notes on the care and handling of their young. His report included several strongly worded recommendations, chief among them being that any future human rescue missions should be equipped with an ample supply of squishmallow hugs. As for Timmy, he was eventually returned to his parents with minimal psychological scarring, though he would have some very interesting stories to tell his friends at school. The crew of the Benevolence waved goodbye to their pint-sized terror with a mixture of relief, and somewhat to their surprise, a touch of fondness. "You know," Gloop burbled as they watched the human family's ship disappear into the starry distance, "I'm almost going to miss the little Dickens." Clack's mandibles clicked in what might have been agreement. He was memorable, the security chief admitted. Zyx'norp nodded, his tentacles finally relaxed after days of anxiety. Indeed he was. "But let's all agree on one thing, shall we?" The crew turned to their captain expectantly. "The next time we pick up a distress signal," Zyx'norp said firmly, "we're going to jolbosody well make sure it's not coming from a human child before we answer it." And with that, the Benevolence set off into the vast expanse of space, its crew a little wiser, a lot more wary, and with a newfound appreciation for the awesome and terrifying power of a sugar rush. As for Blorp, he found himself suddenly in high demand for all future missions involving small, hyperactive life forms, a niche he was more than happy to fill, one squishy hug at a time.